When people discuss large and intimidating fantasy book series, there's a few names that will come up there. Malazan, Book of the Fallen, The Wheel of Time, The Wars of Light and Shadow, but one of the names that you'll hear quite frequently is the Second Apocalypse series by R. Scott Bakker, starting with The Darkness That Comes Before. This is going to be my review for this first book, giving some of my overall impressions, some specific thoughts that I had on the series. So I've been familiar with R. Scott Bakker as an author for a while, but haven't read any of his books until this. So when people talk about grimdark fantasy, which is not a term that I love, I think dark fantasy is a much better term. I think it removes some of the edginess that we use with grimdark. But when we talk about that, the Second Apocalypse series by Bakker is often one of the first names that is mentioned. In fact, on Mark Lawrence's website, he has a ranking list where users are allowed to rank just how dark they think a fantasy book is, and see some sort of flow chart as to what the darkest fantasy novels are, all the way down to pretty lighthearted, benign stuff. And the darkest book on the list is Beyond Redemption by Michael R. Fletcher. That's been rated by the users. But number 2 is this one, The Darkness That Comes Before by Bakker. Now, I have been told by many people who have read this series that the series gets darker as it goes along, and that doesn't surprise me because we'll talk about the tone of this book, but I'm kind of surprised it's ranked number 2 on that website. But people get very passionate about this series. They have very strong feelings about it. It seems like people either absolutely love it or they despise it. They can't stand it. Bakker's been criticized again and again for his portrayal of women, his portrayal of religion, many different things in this series. And so this series is regarded as a challenge because it deals with some very heavy, difficult subject matter. It is 7 books long. The books are not short. I mean, this copy here is around 650 pages, so they're not short books. There's 7 of them, and especially since you're dealing with heavy subject matter, and Bakker's writing style is not exactly easy to get into for many people, it is a challenge to get through. So I'm excited to start this reading journey with this book, but to be perfectly honest, I found this first book to be gripping. Before I get too much into the review, I would like to shout out 2 other reviews for this book. One by Jordan over at iWizard, and the other by Yolanda at the booktube channel StoryTube. These are 2 of the best reviews for this book that I have seen. I think they provide some very excellent insight and thoughts about the book, and they pulled out things and had thoughts and even criticisms of things I hadn't even thought of. So I highly recommend you guys go check that out. And in case you don't know, what is The Darkness That Comes Before about? So this book follows a variety of different points of view as a holy war begins to emerge in this fantasy world. The main points of view that we follow are a wizard and the prostitute, the woman that he loves, as they begin to be caught up in a plot that involves very deep evils and cults that have been long thought to be eliminated or missing. We also follow an arrogant emperor who seeks to use his own family and the various factions that are fighting in this holy war for his own selfish personal gain. We see a Conan the Barbarian style character who finds himself allied with the very people that he was once at war with. Finally, we follow a very mysterious and prophetic character named Kellis, who seems to have his own intentions towards this holy war, his own interest in this war, and is bringing both about a sense of peace, but also seems to be very manipulative in how he interacts with people and how he approaches people. If it seems like the description that I'm giving for this plot is very vague and very general, it's because it is. In many ways, this book reminded me a lot of The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. In that, people will often say that The Blade itself has no plot, and that's not true. It's simply that the plot is seen once you've read the other 2 books. Looking back at The Blade itself, you go, okay, that was what the plot was. I get the suspicion that The Darkness That Comes Before is very similar. As you're reading it, it can seem slow. It could seem plodding to some readers. It could seem like, where are we going with all of this? And for a large portion of the book, I'm asking the same question. Where are we going? What's Bakker doing here? But as you get to the end, and presumably as you get to the future books in the series, it will become much more clear what even the plot of this book was. In many ways, this is a difficult book to review because it is so much an introduction to the series. I can talk about the ideas that Bakker's playing with, I can talk about how he portrays different things, but it's difficult to say anything definitively because I don't know how those things will develop or change or be contradicted by things that will follow in the next 6 books. So I'll do what I can, but let's start out talking about the tone. As I said at the beginning, speaking of the Mark Lawrence poll, this is often regarded as some of the darkest fantasy out there. And I'd specifically like to make the point that I believe this is often regarded as dark. First of all, this book, the reputation that this book has is definitely exaggerated, which should not be terribly surprising. I mean, Prince of Thorns definitely has a much worse reputation than it actually deserves, and this book is no different. But it is a dark book in many ways, and I would say that, in my mind, it is primarily dark because of the absence of light in this book. In terms of graphic content, I did not find book 1. Once again, I'm not speaking for the rest of the books in the series. If you've read them, please don't tell me if I'm wrong or whatever. I'm going to read them, or at least read more of them, so I don't need to be spoiled on that. But for just this book, just book 1, I did not find this to be much more graphic than anything that George Martin does in A Song of Ice and Fire. That's not to say that there aren't disturbing parts or graphic parts. There are, but to me, it seemed about on par with that other series. But what makes this feel much more dark than what Martin does is simply because of the absence of light that is in this book. In A Song of Ice and Fire, you have many characters who are noble, who are trying to do the right thing, who are trying to fight back against the corrupt world that they find themselves in. And in Bakker, with the Second Apocalypse books, at least for this first one, you don't get too much of that. You get characters who have moments of that, but you don't really get any characters that you latch on to that you see as unequivocally good, or that you really thoroughly root for in the same way that you do for many of Martin's characters. Basically, every one of the characters is not just deeply flawed, but has things about them that make them, honestly, deeply unlikable at one time or another. That's not to say that they're badly written, though. By no means. There is not a bad point of view in this book. The point of view shifts at various times, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, but every time we go from one character to another, not once did I find myself going, oh, not this person. Every time we left a point of view, I was like, but I wanted to see more of where that story was going. So even though many of the characters in this book are not likable, are not characters that you're rooting for in the same way that you root for, say, Lord of the Rings characters, they're all interesting, and that's very important. They're all interesting to follow, and you're engaged with them, and you want to see where this story is going to go. One of the fascinating things that Bakker does in this book, and my understanding is that Bakker takes a lot of influence from Tolkien, and that he really wants this to be in conversation with Lord of the Rings. And I can see that in a few key ways. But one of the primary ways that this stuck out to me personally is in the structure of the later 2 Lord of the Rings books. So if you've read those books, the books are split in half, based on Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, other members of the Fellowship, and then what Frodo and Sam are doing. And so for the first half of the book, you'll get, with the main crew of the Fellowship, and then for the second half of the book, you'll get Frodo and Sam and what they're up to. And then Return of the King, same way. For the first half of the book, you get the main Fellowship, and then for the last half, you get Frodo and Sam, until we get to the ending of the book. Now, the effect of this is that things will happen with the Fellowship, and then he ends it, and then you have no clue how that's going to resolve. And because you're not intercutting, where you have, Fellowship and then Frodo and Sam, Fellowship, Frodo and Sam, because of that, you don't get an answer to that for another 200, 300, 400 pages as to what the answer of that may be. Mild spoilers for anybody who hasn't read Lord of the Rings already. The most key example of this is at the ending of the Two Towers. Frodo is presumed dead by Sam and is being taken away by these orcs and goblins away to be tormented and tortured, and is taken away into this dark tower, and Sam passes out on the ground, end of the Two Towers. Then you get Return of the King. And at the end of the section with the main Fellowship and Return of the King, the mouth of Sauron comes out bearing some of Frodo's clothes, some of his personal items, and says, we tortured him to death in our towers in Mordor. And the last you saw of Frodo, you have no reason to believe that that is not exactly true. Because there are these large gaps in between points of view, Tolkien is able to use that to hide information from the reader. Bakker does a very similar thing in this book. Some of the main points of view in this story, some of the main characters in this story and in the series going forward, do not get an appearance until well over halfway through the book. It's sort of an odd structure, and one that I'm sure many readers of modern fantasy will have to adjust to, but I found it to be very interesting and very intentional on his part. As far as the characters in this series, Akamian, the main wizard character, sort of a washed-up wizard, was by far the most compelling to me. He almost has a detective role in the story as he's trying to put pieces together about this ancient cult and about who's really behind these elements of the Holy War and who's aligning with who and for what reason and why are some of the people around him mysteriously dying. Those elements were some of the most fascinating parts of this book, and his lady in the story, Esminette, the prostitute, was also one of the most compelling. There's some really horrific things that happen to her in this story. As I'm sure most people who have heard of the Second Apocalypse have heard, there's some really disturbing violence against women in the story, and violence against men too, but the women especially have it hard in this brutal world that Bakker writes about, and Esminette has to deal with that world as well. Speaking of which, let's talk about the world building here. So Bakker starts out this book and just throws you into the deep end. So for me, it took about 100 pages before I found my footing, because he does not explain many of the terms or many of the places or names. And so you're left dealing with, okay, what are these customs? What are they referring to? Is this a title? Is this a name? What is this? And it took me a good bit into the book before I finally felt comfortable on my feet. And even still, going into book 2, there are a lot of things that I'll be second-guessing myself about, or being like, wait, was that that country, or was it that school name, or what was that? There can be some confusion about that. But I will say, as a fairly new reader to this series, I felt like Bakker gave me enough time to understand. He didn't explain these things to me, but he often would repeat terms or ideas enough that it helped me remember them. It helped me keep up with what he was doing. So he kind of throws you into the deep end, but you can find your footing if you track with him and use the glossary in the back. The glossaries were really a lifesaver. They're short, they're not exhaustive, but the information in them is particularly helpful. One other piece of world building that I'd like to talk about is this. And this might ruffle a few feathers, but this is a story about a holy war. And it is very obvious, even just from a very surface level reading of this book, that Bakker takes a heavy amount of influence from the Crusades, from the real medieval Crusades that happened in the Middle East. And I'm not fully sure how to feel about this, because I think there's a difference between what Bakker does in the text and how this is frequently interpreted. Because what he does is he pulls a lot of symbols and basic concepts about a holy war and puts them from real life and puts them in the book here. But the things that are made analogous from the real world into his book are often not particularly compatible. So, for example, if you're trying to make the analogy and you take the religious group that is pretty clearly the analog for the Catholic Church in this book, and you try to make the argument that this is a statement about Catholicism, the analog in the book resembles in no way even a medieval Catholic Church in terms of belief, structure, even not a single character feels like a medieval Christian. At the best, they feel like Machiavellian secularists, maybe with a paint of belief over the top of it. So that's more my point when it comes to it's not really an equivalent if you try making the one-for-one analogy beyond just the position in the story or maybe some of the iconography. Now, this incompatibility isn't necessarily an issue if he's trying to make a political point. If he's talking about the way nations war and the way people can be manipulated and the way that war is pointless and people use this for their selfish gains. Very good points, very, very well made, very well told in the story. If he's trying to make religious points, that is specifically where I would say I take issue with this. Bakker does not really examine any type of real-life ideas as to what caused the Crusades, say, in the real world. So he's trying to comment on that, and I think some people who read the books think that it is. I don't think that's particularly successful. Now, I did not read this as Bakker trying to comment on religious motivation behind the Crusades, because whichever side you try to defend or you try to paint in a better light than the other side in the Crusades, you end up losing that battle very quickly. I understand there's justifications on both sides, as Star Wars says, there's heroes on both sides. Religious wars as an idea is a very, very messy thing. So if Bakker is trying to comment on specifically Christianity or Islam, I think that doesn't really come through well in the text. There's basically only one character at least in this book, who seems to be a true believer, maybe two. So if the idea is trying to critique the motivation behind the Crusades that were fought, 1,000 years ago on Earth, that's where I think the book might start to fall apart. This pop idea of the Crusades of the Muslims want to take land from the Jews and from the Christians, so they started fighting, and the Christians decided they hated the Muslims, so then they started fighting them, and that's why the Crusades happened. If that's what your understanding of it is, it takes about 5 minutes of watching historian Dan Jones talk about the Crusades to realize actually there's a lot more going on than just that. But my thought on it is, for a book that is specifically about a holy religious war, that's sort of the main thrust of it, I found it personally to be very lacking when it came to any exploration of those religious ideas as to one way or another, or whether Bakker was trying to make any analogous points. Now, I don't know that that was Bakker's point. So the political side of things, like I said, which is much more what I got he was trying to develop, of people selfishness and sort of the cynical nature of people who artificially create those types of situations. That I found to be much more compelling, much more well written, rather than the religious side. If his emphasis wasn't that, then all well and good. Different books are trying to do different things. But for a book about a religious war, the religious point I found to be one of the weaker parts of the book. Now that might change later in the series, but for this book, that's sort of my thoughts. So if I had to knock it down a peg or two for any reason, that would be it. I don't think you need to be pro or anti-religion or have any real position on it to portray it well, to give a nuanced take on it. But especially if you're trying to pull in real world history parts to it, to your story, I think it bears giving some development to it. So that was my one thought on that. Other than that, the world building is definitely interesting. It's part of the story that really gripped me, and exploring especially the different schools of the wizards I think will be interesting to see how that develops later in the series. And I'll say this, although this is often regarded as a difficult series to read, and it is challenging, I found that to be very rewarding for me as a reader. I liked being stretched in those ways and tackling some of the darker ideas that Bakker is playing with, wrestling with some of those difficult questions that he was asking about. And to be honest, the writing in this book is very mature. Not in any type of edgy way do I mean that, but just when thinking about other modern fantasy authors that I read, their writing seemed very simplistic or childish compared to the way Bakker wrote. I've heard people call it biblical prose. I don't know about that specifically, but almost classical in a very mature sense in the way that he wrote. And it took me a little bit to get into that, but I really liked it. Overall, guys, I would say this book lays a lot of groundwork, so it's hard to evaluate it on its own merits. But I'm very interested to see where Bakker takes this series later on. I plan on for sure reading the first trilogy, and if it grips me enough, reading the Aspect Emperor Quartet after the first trilogy. The Darkness That Comes Before was definitely one of my more unique reading experiences this last year. Thank you to everybody who's recommended this book to me. I did enjoy it. It's a weird book to say that you enjoyed reading, but I did. Despite some of my criticisms about it and other grievances that other people bring up, some which I think are probably valid, this definitely is a book that I'm glad I read, and Bakker's doing something different here, which I like. As you can tell from this channel, I love it when fantasy authors really go outside the box and do something different, and I think Bakker does in some pretty interesting ways. Anyway, guys, those are my brief thoughts on the book. Thank you so much for watching this. Let me know what you think about R. Scott Bakker. If there's other books that you think I should be reading that are in a similar vein or that come to mind by this video. Yeah, thank you so much for watching once again. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.